places. I'd like to formally introduce Mr. Matthew Asada. Matthew Asada is a fourth-generation Japanese-American public servant from Detroit. He joined the U.S. Foreign Service as a political officer in 2003, and in July 2013, he was elected by his peers to a 2-year term as State Vice President of the American Foreign Service Association. He's a graduate of the Huntsman program. He finished UPenn in 2002, I believe, and straight after, he went on to diplomatic missions in Southeast Asia and Far East, serving in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India, and Indonesia? Germany, yeah. But it's my distinct honor to welcome Matthew Asada, who's a very active panel among the Carlson brothers. So, Matt, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to your talk. Thanks very much.
Thanks for coming out here this afternoon. It's great to be back in this house. It's great to be back on Penn's campus. I'd like to make this, as informative and as interesting for you as possible. The talk was notionally entitled "The Foreign Service Post Benghazi: What It's Like Now Today to Be a U.S. Diplomat Overseas." But again, it's really I can talk about anything, whether it's experiences in Afghanistan and Pakistan, whether it's my experiences right now in the Union, leading the Union to improve the working conditions for our American diplomats, or just what it's like in Washington, D.C. today. Just before I start out, maybe I can get a show of hands, how many people are interested or thinking about a career in the Foreign Service? Couple? Good. Has anyone taken the Foreign Service exam before? One person. I would encourage you, probably the advice for everyone is to register for the examination. You do not have to have graduated Penn. You do not actually have, there's only 3 requirements to join the U.S. Foreign Service. 1, you have to be a U.S. citizen. You can be a dual national, but you have to be a U.S. citizen. 2, you have to be between the ages of 20 and 60 when you actually join. And 3, you have to pass the test. So you notice I did not mention a language requirement. I did not mention a college degree. Those are not required. And in fact, when I was a junior here at Penn, I went down to DRL, took the exam, passed it. I mean, this is, again, pencil and paper kind of times. But I could have, dropped out of Penn and joined the service because there was no requirement for you to do the degree. But I, wanted to finish my last year here at Penn, and then I went to graduate school, and then I joined the Foreign Service. What I will talk to you a little bit about is maybe what the State Department is, how the Foreign Service is set up, some of the concerns maybe about security these days, again, after these attacks in Benghazi, and then really want to hear from you about your questions that you have. If you don't mind, I'm just going to take a couple steps down here at eye level. The State Department, again, is the oldest cabinet agency in the U.S. government. It is the lead for foreign affairs. And the workforce of the State Department is divided into 3 different groups. You have the Foreign Service, you have the Civil Service, and you have our locally engaged staff. I'll explain each one, but I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the Foreign Service. The locally employed staff are men and women that are working overseas at our embassies and consulates from the host country. So for instance, when I was in Germany, we had many German nationals that were working there in the consulate. They were helping to prepare the materials for the passports, prepare materials for visas, helping us do our cultural events, our exchanges. They were all German nationals, again, citizens of Germany, but they were working for the United States government, and they're a very integral part of our workforce. The second part is the civil service. So again, people based in Washington, D.C., at the Department of State, that are supporting our efforts overseas. They do not go overseas, they're not assigned overseas. They may do a temporary tour of duty, but they're based in Washington, D.C. Then you have the Foreign Service. The Foreign Service, again, the modern Foreign Service was created about 90 years ago. We celebrated the 90th anniversary earlier this May. And it's composed of 2 groups of people, officers and specialists. Officers, there are 5 different types of officers: a political officer, which I am, economic, management, consular, public affairs. Then there are 19 specialties. The specialists are hired for their expertise in a certain area. So you may be, for instance, like an IT professional, or a diplomatic security agent, or a medical officer, or an office management specialist. You're hired because you have a specific skill set that we need to use in the Foreign Service. Specialties, 19 of them. The officers, again, are what are considered generalists and are brought on board for their general knowledge base, the ability to grow into leadership positions, and essentially run the service and help to run the department. Overseas, at our embassies, most of the times you'll have the top person there will be a Foreign Service officer, although we do have political appointees serving as ambassadors as well, and that's something that I'll get into in a little bit. So again, the Foreign Service, in terms of numbers, about 15,000 people. 15,000 people, 2/3 of them overseas. So 10,000 people serving at our embassies and consulates overseas. We have 270 different establishments and posts. Obviously, they're not 270 countries. They're about 180, 190, I think. But we have multiple consulates in countries. So for instance, in India, which was my last overseas assignment, we had the embassy in New Delhi. We had consulates in, well, does anyone know? Anyone familiar with India, having visited it?
Calcutta.
Calcutta's one, that's where I served. Chennai, Mumbai, and Hyderabad. So those are our consulates, in addition to our embassy at the center. So the Foreign Service, again, is going over to staff and support these postings. We may go for a year. If it's a hard place like Afghanistan or Pakistan, we may go for 2 years. If it's at the very beginning of your career, my first assignment in Germany was, for instance, for 2 years in Munich. Or we may go for 3 years, which is the case if I go back to Berlin or back to Paris. So there used to be the option of a 4th year, but that's kind of gone away. So 1, 2, or 3 years for an assignment, and then usually people will go from one overseas assignment to another. Maybe come back to the United States, then go back overseas. But by statute, again, the law, the Foreign Service Act of 1980, you can only stay a certain number of years in the United States before you have to go overseas. So again, our personnel system requires you to pick up, move, take your family, take your partner, take your spouse, sometimes take your parents. Some people travel with their parents as well. And to relocate, which is obviously pretty difficult, especially in some of these other countries. So, Germany, France, not a big deal. India, a little bit less so. But then again, going to Pakistan, going to some places in Africa, going to some places in South America, Central America, it can be very difficult. And it's taxing, and it's hard to maintain, obviously, those relationships. So that's just a little bit about, again, the Foreign Service, the men and women that are going abroad. It's about 15,000, remember. What do they do when they're overseas? Again, the primary way that Americans have contact with the Foreign Service is usually your passport. That's the document, and that's most Americans' contact with the State Department, issuing you a passport that you use to go and travel. And it's partly because at the heart of it, the value or the role of the State Department is to take care of our American citizens. So if you go overseas, you need a travel document, your passport. If you get into trouble, we want to take care of you. So again, when I was in Munich, serving as in our American Citizen Services section, obviously what's Munich famous for? Oktoberfest. So a lot of Americans coming to Oktoberfest every year, and as you can imagine, getting into trouble sometimes. Losing their passport, maybe having too much to drink, getting to the hospital, becoming a victim of crime. There's stuff that happens. And the American consulate, the consular officer, will be there to assist you. Now, they're not going to spring you out of jail. This is a widely held misnomer that will free you. If you commit a crime overseas, you're subject to the laws and jurisdiction of that land. But we will ensure that you receive all the protections due as an American citizen, that you're treated fairly. So that's one way, again, that we interact. For some of you, I'm sure we have maybe some, international students here in the audience. Like, your encounter with the State Department, with the Foreign Service, is probably through a visa. So you came at one point to an embassy or a consulate, you talked to someone like myself or one of my colleagues, and we asked you some questions, and hopefully it was a pleasant experience, and we then gave you your visa. and you're able to study here in the United States. We know it's not always the time that easy, and sometimes it may be less than pleasant, but our goal is to provide you a good customer service experience. But that's a way that, again, a lot of the foreign international public would interact with the consulate through a visa interview. But that's just one part. Again, obviously, when I go overseas, when my colleagues, the econ officers go overseas, we're looking at the political relationship. So right now, take any topic. Let's say Syria and Iraq. Like, if we're trying to gain political support from other countries for what we're doing there, then it's going to be our political officer that's going to be going in there to talk to the host country, the government, and say, will you support us on this? Will you support us at the United Nations when we ask for a resolution? An economic officer, again, following India, it's something that South Asia are very interested in. We just had the visit of Prime Minister Modi came. They signed some economic agreements. They looked at some efforts to combat climate change, reduce carbon emissions. Our economic section may be leading those efforts to those negotiations. Public affairs, pretty self-explanatory. Again, doing our press outreach, press spokesman, or doing our cultural exchanges. So if anyone's ever been on type of an exchange program as a Fulbright, those are done through the State Department. That's done through our public diplomacy section. And the fifth category of an officer is management. They're taking care of the place. They're making sure everything runs. It could be as basic as making sure you have a generator at your house, electricity, that you have a car to be able to get around. Or it could be something like IT, like managing the IT network, both unclassified and our classified systems. So those are the 5 different types of officer positions. And in my experience, again, I started out, my first job was a management officer. Second job was doing visas, had a visa unit. Third position was on a German military base in Afghanistan, doing reporting, development, kind of some military work. Then I went as a political economic chief in Calcutta. So again, I've done all of these, 4 of the 5, overseas. Coming back home, I focus again some policy work on Afghanistan and Pakistan, working with Ambassador Holbrooke, Ambassador Grossman. I was on the Hill as a congressional fellow, so again, seeing Congress's role in foreign affairs, which is really important. Or then again, the last 2 tours have been in management. Again, how do we manage this diplomatic workforce? How do we grow? How do we recruit people? How do we retain them? How do we promote them? Or now, in my capacity, how do we advocate in our union capacity for those employees? So that's just a short snapshot to give you an idea of the extent of a career in the Foreign Service, how varied it can be. Like literally, from one year to the next, doing a completely different job, completely different country, maybe even completely different language. As I said at the very beginning, you don't have to speak a foreign language to get into the service as an officer. However, to be commissioned as a tenured officer, you do. So we will either teach you a language or you'll come in with a language, and within 5 years you need to get tenured. And then you'll be recommended for tenure. And remember I mentioned Congress. Congress plays an important role in this. As a commissioned officer, all of us are Senate confirmed. So the White House will nominate us, the Senate will confirm us, the President will attest us, and finally we'll become officers in the Foreign Service. It's a very lengthy process. It's not a formality, I can tell you that from experience. This spring, the union, AFSA, had to work on behalf of about 1,800 people. Remember I said 15,000 people, right? So more than 10% of the service was stuck in the Senate. The Senate had not confirmed them. They were not able to do all of their jobs and responsibilities. So we had to engage as the union, meeting with Republicans, Democrats, all in the Senate, because only the Senate can confirm. The House doesn't play any part in that. But to help craft an agreement to get 1,800 people through, and that's what we were able to do. So, again, the variety of experience, it's one that will never get boring, and it'll always have something new to learn in this process. I want to talk a little bit maybe about some of the things that have happened regarding security since, again, Benghazi, since these attacks, and then I want to hear from you about your questions about the service or my experiences. So, obviously we had are people familiar with the attacks in Benghazi? Pretty familiar with it, what happened? Our embassy was in Tripoli. We had a temporary mission facility, annex compound, whatever you want to call it. It was not a consulate, it wasn't an embassy, but an establishment in Benghazi. Our ambassador, Chris Stevens, a career Foreign Service officer, went out there for a visit because he thought that he had, again, to do some outreach, some policy work, and went out there obviously with a security detail. Fortunately, they came under attack, and 4 people died in ensuing events. And every time that a American diplomat dies overseas, in an event like that, they have to convene an accountability review board. So again, they had a panel kind of look into this, what happened, and how can we prevent this from happening again. And so since that event and since that panel, we, AFSA, the union, have been very concerned about what's happening with our people overseas. Obviously, we want to ensure that everyone is safe overseas, but at the same time that they're able to get out and do their jobs. And one of the things that we found is what's being known as the Benghazi effect. So it's become very difficult for people to get out of the embassies. The embassies are becoming more bunker-like, and it's really preventing us from effectively engaging and talking to students and talking to political leaders, business leaders, and it's weakening our understanding of the people and ultimately, again, our national security. So that's what AFSA has really focused in on. How can we ensure that our men and women have the training that they need, that they understand the languages to stay safe, to recognize a dangerous situation, and the security awareness training it too. So that, again, when they're in a situation, fire breaks out, or there's crowds that start to riot, or heaven forbid there's a terrorist attack, what do? And so by focusing in on the training, language, and security awareness, we're helping to prepare our men and women, our diplomats, for their roles overseas. But again, we need to make sure that they have the ability to get out. And that's really, really important because in my now 11 years with the Foreign Service, I've seen over time it's become more and more difficult. And that's something that, again, if we're going to be effective, if America is going to lead in the world, we need to be able to get out and engage. So it's something that we've really kind of focused in on. And Congress has continued to have their hearings and investigations into what happened in Benghazi. And I don't believe it's up yet, but the joint committee, or the committee that was established to look into this, recently had a hearing on the recommendations from this event. And they had one of the congressmen there, Adam Schiff from California, actually talk about this Benghazi effect and why it's so important that we're able to get out and able to do our jobs overseas. So we've been what's interesting about my current job is the ability to get to talk to our men and our congressmen, congresswomen, their staffs, explain again the importance of the work that we do on behalf of the country and the nation, and why we need to be able to get out there and speak with people to do it. I just want to leave you with one thought, and then again open it up to any questions that you have about a problem that is currently facing, again, the Foreign Service. This is where the United States Foreign Service is a little bit different from the British, the Germans, the Pakistanis, the Indians, that the majority of other countries' foreign services are career for ambassadors. So the head of the mission, the chief of mission, the ambassador, is usually a career foreign service officer. You look in Washington, D.C. right now, almost all of the people from Western Europe, G20, any way you organize it, you look at it, they're all from the career service. But in the United States, we have a tradition, for better or worse, where there's a lot of political appointees. And so 2/3 of the ambassadors come from the career foreign service. So 2/3 of people out there right now serving as ambassadors are people that are in the union, that are in the association, and 1/3 of them are political appointees. And what we're really concerned about is that there's some really good people that are coming from outside. But some of these people don't appear to have the qualifications, or their primary qualification appears to be how much money they gave to the president's campaign. And we object to that, not only because it's against the law, it's just bad practice. It's not good for the nation to have someone who may not speak the language, who may not have any understanding of how we work, who may not have the ties to be able to effectively advocate for you and me overseas. So again, there's an issue of having qualified people serve as ambassadors, and there's also an issue of the Senate confirming them as well. And right now, again, the Senate plays an important role in this, as I mentioned before. Right now, we have about 4 dozen or so ambassadors that are waiting for the Senate to take action. And so usually, or in some cases, you say you don't want Congress to take any action at all. Just keep it as it is. But in this case, we really need the Senate to confirm these men and women, because right now, again, we're without an ambassador. You're one man down. You're less effective. You're less able to engage when we need these countries the most. So with that, again, providing a little bit of an overview of what the Foreign Service is, maybe a little bit about, again, some of the security issues overseas, some of the congressional relations. I want to open up to you and hear your questions about any of these topics. In the back.
You talked a lot about engaging people within the different countries who wish to support the but we've seen rising anti-American sentiment in the Middle East and North Africa. What do you think the Foreign Service's role in fighting that should be, if at all?
Well, again, the primary task of the Foreign Service, and so here, again, going back to those 5 different types of officers, would be the public affairs officers, the public diplomacy section, is to explain and engage what America is all about. Now, it's factually, these are our policies, or these are our values, or these are the ways that we can help you see and learn about America. Again, those cultural exchange programs that are so important. And so, at this point in time, when we're seeing a rise in some of these places of people that may not understand us or may not like us, I would say it's all the more reason why we need to increase our outreach and our engagement in those areas to explain. But noting, we're not trying to be everyone's friend, but we are trying to ensure that we have an understanding, we have a relationship, so that we can engage, and when there are misperceptions, that we can correct those. So it's really, I think, all the more important. And it's all the more important that we actually can get out of the embassy to do that. Because these people, again, if someone has a contrary opinion, you need to engage them on their turf, because you can't hole yourself up at the embassy and just say the problem solved. Yeah, in the back.
What are the requirements and the application process for the service?
So again, there's 3 requirements: U.S. citizen to join the Foreign Service, U.S. citizen, 20 to 60, and pass the test. The test is offered multiple times now. Again, it used to be when I was here, it was offered once a year. But it's offered multiple times. There's actually one coming up here in October. And what's great about it is that there's no cost for the test itself. And there's no penalty for not passing it. It's not held against you. The next time you take the test, they have no idea that you applied before. Your score will not go into it. It may save you some time when you register that you don't have to fill all the information again. But so I would encourage you to take a look at the online process for the online test, because that's the first step. And once you pass the online test, let's say about, I think, 25,000 people take the online test, just to give you a sense of numbers. Then there's the next part where they look at your actual resume and your writing samples. It's called the QEP. It didn't exist when I took it. They introduced it to give more a whole-of-candidate approach. Then it comes down to the oral assessment. So if you pass the QEP, then there's about 2,000 people that are invited to an oral assessment, an interview. Most of them take place in Washington, D.C., although they do offer it in a couple different places around the country. Of those 2,000, they narrow it down to about 300 people. So 300 people enter the Foreign Service each year as officers. Again, this is only for officers. Specialists, those 19 different areas, they have a different hiring process, but again, a very competitive pool as well. The other deadline you should be aware of, for those of you who are maybe sophomores or juniors, is to look at an internship with the State Department. And we actually have established, we being the department, have established a paid summer internship program that actually will consist of 2 internships, one that will be domestic, one that would be overseas. It's a brand new program. We've always had an internship program. It hasn't always been paid, but now this is actually a 2 internship program, something brand new. You can find out information about this on our website, careers.state.gov, and I encourage you to take a look at that. Because the internship, again, when I was a sophomore here at Penn, so 3 people that year actually from the castle interned overseas as sophomores, which is pretty, usually people do this when they're juniors, but here at Penn you can be competitive as a sophomore as well. We were interning in different places, 2 in South America. I was in Frankfurt, and that was the real first time that I'd ever worked in a consulate. Really kind of gave me some exposure to this. And when I came back after that sophomore summer, then I really wanted to focus in on the Foreign Service, and that kind of got me hooked. It was a good application of my language skills. I was studying German here. Good application of the Huntsman, the business side that I wanted to do. And so after that internship, I kind of narrowed down and focused on the Foreign Service. So the internship program is great to look at. Look again, it has a very early deadline. I believe it's November 1st for next summer. So you'll want to think about this now and start to apply. And then obviously think about taking the test as well, the Foreign Service exam.
So I know you mentioned political appointees as ambassadors and the role of the political person in the 5 different groups. But like when each new president comes along, obviously they bring along the foreign policy agenda. How does that change your work with each election? Like, do you get a new set of agendas, or how does it work?
So definitely, I mean, the Foreign Service is apolitical. We serve whoever is in power. So again, whatever president's there, whatever Secretary of State he or she brings, we're working for them. And they're going to be they'll have some general policy ideas, direction of where they want us to go, and we're responsive to that. But you would note, actually, for any IR majors, like, that the foreign policy is pretty constant, actually, across parties. It doesn't change all that much. There really is a bipartisan consensus for most foreign policy issues. And so there may be different areas of focus. Obviously right now, President Obama, when he came in here, he wanted to devote a lot of time and attention to the Israel-Palestine peace process. That was a presidential, it's always been an issue, but he wanted to make that a focus. You see right now we're doing a lot of work on climate change and what that means for the United States, what it means for our economic competitiveness, what it means for obviously the environment and our future. So priorities like that will change. They'll be sent down so that out in the field we're able to implement those programs. But I would maybe explain like this. Policy is not made in the field. So the foreign policy that we're doing, when we're on the ground in India and Germany and France, we're not making the policy there. What we are doing is we're implementing policy that's been decided back here in Washington. And we're maybe transmitting messages to the German or French government, trying to get them to buy and get them support. Or we're reporting back to Washington as to how our policy is doing, what the French population thinks about it, what the German population thinks about it. And so it's much more of a reporting relationship action from the field, feeding the policy-making organ in Washington itself, with the state, and it's not just the State Department, it's the State Department, Department of Defense, the intelligence agencies, all of that coming together. And whenever it was decided, then we'll go back out to the field. Now, obviously, the ambassadors that are out there, senior foreign service officers or political appointees, they carry a lot of weight, and they can help influence it, but they're not the final determiner for a lot of these things.
Is there any incentive in terms of, you've talked about like passing foreign service exam, but like, I don't know how it works in terms of the grading. It's like the better you do entail better, chances of getting a more desirable station overseas, or what's the incentive, I guess, for doing better than just passing?
Yeah, so there is, you get a score. So from the oral assessment, you will get a score. And so when I was a junior here at Penn, I passed the test. I received a score, I think, of 5.3. And at that time, it was good enough to enter as a consular officer or a management officer. So I could have joined the Foreign Service and done one of those 2 fields. However, I wanted to come in as a political officer. So then again, my senior year, I took it again, and I got a higher score. And so the second time I got it, my score was high enough to be able to enter as a political officer. So yes, the different cones have different cutoffs. And your score is not only the score that you get from the examination, but you can get bonus points if you speak a language. So again, I spoke German, so I got a couple of points for German. If you speak Arabic or Chinese Mandarin, you'll get even more points. because those languages are in high demand. Yes?
Do a lot of people like stay in foreign service for life, or do it just for like 10 years or so?
So the Foreign Service, according to the Foreign Service Act, is meant to be a career. And it has, it's set up that way. The normal age of someone entering the Foreign Service in what's called the A100 class is actually 31. So that's the average age, the mean. I was, 22 when I came in, so one of the youngest in my class. But there's some people, again, as old as 59, 60 that are entering. The person that's entering at 60, by statute, only has 5 years, because 65 is a mandatory retirement age. On the other hand, someone like myself, I'm also limited on how long I can stay in the service. We have what's called a time in service rule. But we also have a retirement system that is modeled a little bit like the military. And that means that 20 years of service, you can qualify then for a pension. And albeit you need to be 50 years of age to avail that. So because I started at 22, I'll actually have to work 28 years until I'm able to retire. But if you started at 30, then you work 20 years, you can retire at 50 with a pension. So there's a lot of incentives to do it as a career because of that pension option. But what we're finding, people that are in school today are thinking less and less about their career in the traditional sense, like one employer, lifelong kind of thing. And so I think what we're going to see is that people that are coming into service in the future maybe are looking to do it 5 or 10 years and then do something else. We're going to have people that want to do it for an entire 20 years. We're going to have someone that want to do it 10 and someone want to do 5. And we need to be able to accommodate all of them. But the incentive structure is set up to reward and recognize people that stay for the 20 years to get a pension.
After Putin's aggression in Ukraine, has the diplomatic talks between the U.S. and Russia changed a lot? And if so, how?
So one of the things I should say is that obviously today, I'm not speaking as a representative of the Department of State.
You know more than I do.
But just to clarify that, I'm speaking as elected union officer. So I actually have a freedom of speech to talk about the conditions and terms and employees and all that good stuff. That being said, my specialty has been South Asia and then Europe. More Germany, UK, Britain, EU. And I haven't worked on those, I haven't worked on Russia, Ukraine for a couple of years. But I'll say this, is that I think it's, what's changed? Or how do you think about these things? And one of the books that I recommend, I don't know if it's required reading for any of you, but is Robert Kaplan's Revenge of Geography. Has anyone read it? Or you kind of, it's a great book. And it explains kind of some of the areas around the world that are real kind of focal points. And Russia, being historic, if you look at its geography, it talks a lot about kind of how it has survived and what's happened to it over time. Think about a country that's gone through the devastating experience of World War II, that lost millions of people. They're scared, they're worried, they're concerned about invasion, of a land invasion. And so they see things differently. They see things happening in Ukraine as being very threatening to their interests, to their territorial integrity, geography of Russia. Obviously we, over here in the United States, Ukraine's not our immediate neighbor. Ukraine's not a NATO ally. So we see things a little bit differently, and our interests there may be different as well. So I think what I would just say is, again, it's important to consider the historical context and take a long view. And sometimes we, in the United States, Americans, we don't have that historical insight and perspective. And so that maybe changes kind of how we react to some situations.
What's the quality of life like for either internships abroad or working in the foreign service abroad?
So the quality of life, again, it's something that, being in the union, we care a lot about, trying to make it as good as we can and as safe as we can. But I'll just give you my experience. So as an intern, when I was a sophomore going to Frankfurt, I actually stayed with a German host family. So I found somebody and I stayed with them for the summer, and it was a great experience. Like lived there, spoke German all the time. They had kids that were my age who were going out. It was a really good experience. Sometimes you'll get an actual housing as an intern. Sometimes you will not. So sometimes it's paid, sometimes it's not. But all in all, it's a pretty good setup as an intern. They'll usually try to take good care of you. As an officer or as a specialist overseas, again, you're getting a house, so they'll take care of your lodging and accommodation. If you have children, they'll take care of their schooling expenses. So whether it is a school overseas or in some cases it's boarding school back here in the United States. There's different allowances for cost of living. If it's more expensive in that country, like in Tokyo, Switzerland, your salary will be translated based on that. And then if you're serving in a place that's considered more difficult, like Calcutta was considered a more difficult place to live, they gave you a differential. And so that was an additional allowance or a danger allowance for like Afghanistan. So it really depends though, because in Germany I was living on what was considered like a housing compound. It was an apartment building right on the downtown Central Park. It was an amazing location. It was like 2 minutes walk and of the Central Park of Munich. But on the German military base in Afghanistan, I was living in one room on a military base, and obviously had different abilities to get in and out. So, but overall, the quality of life is pretty good. And to be able to represent the United States as an American diplomat, there's a lot of protocol, but you receive a lot of access and entree to society wherever you are.
You obviously will travel a lot as a foreign service, but what does that impact? How does that impact your personal life? Like traveling, like maybe every year. I don't know how much you're like in a certain period.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. What happens to your personal life when you're overseas? Having a relationship is more difficult because in advance that you're going to be there a year. Maybe they're 2 years. The other person may not know that when you first meet them, and that's a conversation that you have to have. And then you have to figure out, hey, is that person going to come with me to my next post, or is this going to be finite?
Yeah.
Once you decide, maybe to get married, or to have a domestic partner, then you can bring that person overseas. They may or may not be able to work in that country. It depends on the bilateral work agreement. Some countries will allow for it. Some countries will not. Some countries will have more rights than others. There is, unfortunately, a lot of the foreign services like American society. There's a lot of divorce that takes place as well, and that becomes a difficult thing to manage in the foreign service. But I would just say that it's become a lot easier probably to stay connected to family back home, as well as to have a relationship, as well as to stay in touch with American society and culture because of the internet, telecommunications, Skype, everything else that's going on. So a lot easier today in some aspects. Some aspects it could actually be harder because you're constantly in contact. But it is something that you have to think about. And then kids, okay, do you want to take your kids out of high school, their senior year in high school? Do you really want to take them and move them, to Germany and have them leave all their friends back here at home? So those are things that you have to work out, but it's up to each person to kind of figure out what works for them and for their family and for their loved ones. Yeah.
So what's sort of your cultural background, and how does that play a role in your missions abroad?
That's a good question. So as I mentioned, I'm Japanese American, so biracial and fourth generation. So I've always kind of had a sense of appreciation for another culture. I don't speak Japanese, unfortunately. Never learned it. My dad kind of spoke a little bit of it, but it gives you an appreciation for another language, another culture, another region, another way of doing business, maybe another religion. And so probably, if anything, it just sensitized me to knowing and understanding that my culture was not the only way, for instance. And it helps when I was in a place like in Afghanistan and Pakistan that are Muslim majority countries. thinking about that a little bit different, or in a place like India that's so religiously diverse, that has Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Jains, Christians, Zoroastrians, Parsis, a lot of different religions. So it just kind of gave me a real awareness and appreciation, I think, which is very healthy.
Are there additional safety concerns for women? And like how many women are in the foreign service?
So, great question. And actually, so I brought 2 magazines along, actually, from the Foreign Service Journal. It's the magazine that we put out every month. The yellow one from October is focused all about specialists. And so you can learn about these different specialties. Remember, there's 19 and there's 5. These are the specialists. The other one, the blue one from September, talks about some of the awards that we've offered to our members, but it also talks about diversity in the Foreign Service. And so it talks about the racial diversity, it talks about the gender diversity, and I would say that the Foreign Service today is the most diverse that we've ever had. And the incoming classes of new officers, they're about 50-50 men and women. Now, that obviously is going to take some time to filter through the system, because for long periods of time, there were no women, then there were no married women, and then obviously that's changed over the years. But incoming classes were 50-50. Now, being a woman in some of these places, obviously not speaking from personal experience, but from my colleagues, like when they were, like my predecessor, the person that was before me in the job in Afghanistan, she was telling me about her experience. And yeah, sometimes it meant that she was able to go into the areas that were all men because she was considered, an American diplomat. Sometimes she did decide not to. It meant that, on the other hand, though, she could socialize and talk to all the Afghan women that we didn't have access to. And so it'll really depend on the country that you're in, the culture. Security concerns, though, like the diplomatic security is going to be just as protective as me as they are as of you. And they're going to make sure that, again, nothing happens to either one of us. But it'll be something that you'll just have to feel comfortable with, like going into the marketplace. Do you want to go by yourself? Are you comfortable? Do you feel like you need to go with somebody else? It'll really depend. But a lot of my female colleagues, served with me in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and we're just right side by side, and we're able to manage.
All right, I think we might have time for maybe one more question, if there's one.
Yeah, just wondering, are there any clubs or organizations on campus that you recommend or that you found interesting?
So when I was here, I think it's called IAA, but it's still around, International Affairs Association. They ran model UN conferences. So I did that a couple of years, and that was a really good experience. The other things I was involved with was computer literacy. I was involved in the performing arts group. But I would just say follow your interests and your passions. We don't want to just hire people that are great IR majors. We want to hire people that are passionate about what they want to do, that understand business, or that are accomplished musicians, or that are passionate journalists, or just great with working with people, managing our human resources. So you want to stand out as a candidate. Because when it comes down to the interview, the oral assessment, we want to know that you have, yes, some substantive knowledge, that you have good judgment, but that you're also going to be great for the service and bring your own, unique perspective into it. You're going to innovate. You're going to challenge us. So again, if you like IIA, great. It's a great way of doing it. But I wouldn't discount other things: literary, cultural, arts, languages. I'm sure, each language has kind of some, club or thing around it. So those are all ways to get and stay involved. So I'm happy to, again, talk individually with people, and always happy to contact any Penn students. If you're ever in DC, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We welcome interns as well. We actually have a former intern with us right now in the audience. I won't out him. He can out himself. But we offer internships at the union, at AFSA, obviously, as well as at the Department of State. And happy to talk to Penn students about what a career in the Foreign Service is like. So thanks a lot for coming. Again, feel free to take any information in the back.